A homeless girl accidentally witnesses a murder plot. Will her courage be enough to save a life and change her own fate? Katie sat on a cold sidewalk, right at the edge of the bustling main street. Her worn-out coat, offering little protection against the biting wind, was riddled with stains and tears. Beside her lay a folded piece of cardboard, her makeshift shelter and the one constant in her life. In her other hand, she held a paper cup, hoping for the kindness of strangers to drop in spare change. But tonight, the cup was nearly empty. Katie's eyes darted around, watching the flow of people. Some hurried home after work, others strolled with their children. Each person seemed absorbed in their own world, their own struggles. She knew she was invisible to them, just another piece of the street they preferred to ignore. Her bare, calloused feet, hardened from endless days on rough pavement, barely registered the freezing cold anymore. She had adapted? Hunger, however, remained her constant companion. It had been 2 days since she last ate, dry crust scavenged near a dumpster. The ache in her stomach had grown unbearable. Katie realized she had no choice but to ask for help, yet every word felt like a monumental effort. Her voice, hoarse from countless futile attempts to appeal to indifferent passers-by, barely rose above a whisper. "Please, just a little. I haven't eaten in 2 days," she murmured, but her pleas often fell on deaf ears. Her daily fight for survival was a relentless cycle. Each morning, she woke on the cold cement of some alley, gathered her meager belongings, and braved the streets once more. She knew where scraps of food might be found, but those spots were often crowded with others in need. Fights over discarded leftovers were not uncommon. Katie was alone. She couldn't even recall the last time someone had spoken to her with kindness. Her heart sank deeper into despair. But deep down, a small flicker of hope still lingered. A tiny spark. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe someone would notice her. Maybe one day, she could return to a warm home where she wouldn't have to beg, where fear wouldn't follow her every step. Summoning her courage, Katie pushed herself off the sidewalk and stepped into the flow of people. She stretched out her hand, holding the plastic cup tightly. Her gaze was timid but desperate. "Please, help me, just enough for bread," she repeated, trying to make her voice heard above the noise of the crowd. People bundled in warm coats and jackets barely glanced her way. A man with heavy shopping bags quickened his pace as she approached. A young woman with earbuds pretended not to see her. Even a couple strolling leisurely averted their eyes, avoiding her gaze. Katie approached a well-dressed woman in a dark blue coat with a fur collar, carrying several shopping bags from high-end stores. Katie reached out to get her attention. "Excuse me, can you spare just a little? Just for bread?" she whispered. The woman stopped and jerked her arm away in irritation when Katie accidentally brushed against her coat. "What do you think you're doing, you filthy thing? This coat costs more than you'll ever make in your life," the woman snapped, stepping back. Katie tried to explain, her voice trembling. "Please, I didn't mean to, I'm sorry." But the woman wasn't finished. Her face twisted with anger. "Don't come near me. You smell terrible. Why aren't you in a foster home or some shelter?" "Oh, right, because you'd actually have to work there." The crowd began to take notice. Some people looked on with curiosity, others with disapproval. Seeing this, the woman's irritation only grew. "All you people know how to do is beg and steal. Why doesn't anyone clean the streets of trash like you?" she added sharply. Katie felt tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Suddenly, the woman shoved her aside, and Katie fell onto the grimy pavement. Her cup hit the ground, scattering a few coins. "Look at her. Lying there like a pig," the woman scoffed before walking away. Katie stayed on the cold ground, staring at the scattered coins, too ashamed to pick them up. Her heart ached with pain and humiliation. People passed by, some filming on their phones, but no one stopped to help. Katie slowly got up from the cold pavement, avoiding eye contact with the passers-by. Her legs trembled beneath her, and a strange emptiness settled in her chest. People around her were talking, some laughing quietly, others filming with their phones. But no one stopped to help or even offer her a kind word. Katie felt invisible, unwanted. It was as if she weren't a person but just another part of the dirty street beneath them. The crowd began to thin, and she realized she couldn't stay there any longer. Taking a shaky breath, she grabbed her cardboard, clutching it tightly as though it were her most valuable possession, and ran. The street stretched endlessly before her, as if it would never end. Her legs, accustomed to the cold and pain, now felt heavy as lead. Katie turned into an alley, seeking refuge from the stares and noise. Her breath came in gasps. She stopped by a wall, leaning against the cold bricks as tears began to flow freely. Katie couldn't hold them back anymore. She cried silently, the way people do when they've long stopped expecting comfort. Painful thoughts swirled in her mind, each one sharper than the last. Why didn't anyone hear her? Why did everyone see her as dirty, a thief, or worthless? She had never hurt anyone. Why did life turn out this way? She hadn't chosen this. Katie glanced at the cardboard in her hands. It was her home, her only shield against the rain and wind. Her fingers shook, and one thought echoed in her mind. If she disappeared now, would anyone even notice? No one was looking for her. No one cared. She recalled the woman in the blue coat, the look of disgust in her eyes. Those words replayed in her head like a haunting refrain. Filthy? Thief? Nobody. Drawing in a deep breath, Katie reminded herself that she couldn't give up. She always told herself, just one more day, one more step, one more try. If she stopped now, everything would end. And she wanted to live. She glanced down the alley. Its darkness seemed endless, but faint lights shimmered far in the distance. Those lights carried a fragile hope. Wiping her tears with the back of her hand, Katie took another step forward. Her footsteps echoed in the empty alley, and her thoughts circled the same question. Where could she find help? Where could she stay warm? She knew the city had places where she might get a meal or some shelter, but the thought of going there scared her. Those places were filled with kids like her, and they never shared. They fought over every scrap. Katie didn't want to face their hostility and envy again. She knew how much it hurt to have her last coins taken, to be pushed aside like she didn't matter. She had always been on her own, and it felt like that would never change. Her fear grew with each step, but she pushed it away. She thought about warmth, about food. Maybe she'd find a piece of bread, maybe luck would smile on her again. Her legs carried her toward a familiar spot, the back alley behind a restaurant where leftover food was often thrown away. The air there always smelled like grilled meat and warm bread, a scent that filled her with fleeting dreams of a better life. She made up her mind to get there, no matter what. Katie arrived at the back of the restaurant, dragging her feet. She knew this part of the city well. There were always dumpsters here, and they gave off the comforting aroma of food. This place felt like a tiny island of hope. Despite her exhaustion, a faint sense of joy flickered inside her. Maybe today she'd get lucky. She scanned her surroundings to make sure no one was watching. The restaurant workers often chased people like her away, yelling threats and sometimes even swinging brooms. Katie crouched near one of the dumpsters, pulling her old hoodie over her face to avoid attention. She began rummaging through the trash. Her fingers touched damp paper, plastic wrappers, and scraps of food. After a few minutes, her hand landed on something solid. Katie pulled out a small loaf of bread. It was still wrapped, nearly untouched. Her heart raced, and she let out a sigh of relief. This was her chance to ease her hunger, even if only a little. Katie quickly stuffed the bread into her pocket, afraid someone might take it from her. She knew that if other kids saw it, they wouldn't hesitate to snatch it away. Looking at the dumpster, she thought about searching a bit more. There might be something else. But her joy quickly started to fade. She felt like someone was watching her. Her eyes darted nervously toward the restaurant window. A yellow light glowed inside, and shadows moved in rhythm with the bustling kitchen. Katie froze, listening to the clatter of dishes and the footsteps of workers. No one appeared to be looking out, but something about the place made her uneasy. Her wariness grew as she noticed the kitchen window was slightly open. She crept closer and peeked inside. Everything inside was spotless, gleaming under bright lights. Chefs in white aprons moved swiftly among steaming pots and pans. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but Katie couldn't shake the feeling that her excitement over the bread was mingling with a strange sense of unease. Pressing herself against the cold brick wall, she tried to get a better view through the open window. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with activity. The chefs were hunched over the stoves, plating dishes on long counters, while servers dashed around with trays in hand. The sound of frying pans and knives blended with snippets of conversation. It seemed like everything was going as usual. But then, a woman appeared in the kitchen. Katie immediately noticed her. The woman's red dress stood out against the strict uniforms of the kitchen staff. The clicking of her high heels echoed off the floor, and her confident posture was evident in every step she took. This was Veronica Warren, the wife of the well-known businessman, Andrew Warren. Katie had seen her in magazines thrown out in dumpsters, images of her still fresh in her mind. Katie froze. She couldn't figure out why such a high society woman would be in the kitchen. People of her status typically didn't enter places so loud and hot, never paying attention to the busy workers. But Veronica seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Veronica confidently approached one of the counters, where the chef was finishing the decoration of an elegant dish. Katie noticed Veronica glance around, as if checking if anyone was watching. The chef stepped back a few paces to speak with a waiter, and in that moment, Veronica quickly retrieved a small vial from her purse. The vial shimmered in her hands, its dark glass catching the light from the overhead lamps. Katie inched closer, trying to see what she was doing. Veronica carefully opened the vial and dropped several drops of dark liquid onto the dish. Her movements were precise, confident, without hesitation. Then, she closed the vial, tucked it back into her purse, and casually stepped away. Her face remained calm, even satisfied. Katie felt a tightness in her chest. She understood that what she had just witnessed was something terrible. This wasn't an accident. She had seen poison. She knew Veronica had just poisoned the dish, and it was no joke. Katie glanced back at the plate, its intricate design of meat and garnish looking so delicious. But now she understood. It was a deadly trap. "It's poison," she whispered to herself, feeling a coldness spread inside her. Her mind began to race. Katie realized she had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch someone die. But what could someone like her do? No one would believe her. People looked at her like she was just another filthy beggar. If she ran into the restaurant shouting, they'd throw her out or call the cops. Katie clutched the cardboard she was still holding in her hands. Her thoughts darted between fear and resolve. Her heart was telling her to act before it was too late. But common sense told her she would only face more humiliation and disbelief. What if I'm wrong? A thought flickered in her mind. But then she remembered Veronica's assured movements and the look on her face. No, this wasn't a mistake. This woman really intended to hurt someone. Katie watched as the waiter picked up the plate with the dish and carried it into the dining room. Her insides twisted. She couldn't stand still any longer. "I have to do something," she whispered, struggling against her own fear. The girl clenched her fists, wiped her sweaty palms on her old jacket, and took her first step toward the restaurant. She knew time was running out, but her mind was filled with only one thought: prevent the disaster. Katie stood by the window, feeling the cold wind cut through her thin jacket. Her thoughts were loud, chaotic, making her doubt herself. What if they just throw me out? What if no one listens to me? But in her mind, there was only one image: the poisoned plate that might already be on someone's table. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. She knew she had to act. Clenching her hands into fists, Katie rushed toward the restaurant's entrance. The large glass doors, behind which lay a world of luxury, seemed like an impenetrable fortress to her. At the entrance stood a security guard, tall, burly, with a scowl on his face. He immediately noticed Katie and took a step toward her. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, blocking her path. "This place isn't for people like you." Katie stopped, realizing that her enthusiasm had collided with reality. But the fear quickly shifted into a quiet determination. "There's danger," she whispered. "Please, let me in." The guard smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Something important for you in there?" he sneered. "Go away, girl. This place is for people who pay, not for beggars." Katie stepped closer, almost shouting, "There's poison in the food. I saw everything. It's important. If you don't let me in, someone might die." But the guard didn't move. His face grew serious. "Listen, stop wasting my time. Don't cause a scene. Leave now, before I call the cops." Katie felt the heat rise in her cheeks from the helplessness, but she couldn't give up. Steeling herself, she took another step forward. "I'm not joking," she shouted. "I saw the woman. She poisoned the food. You have to believe me." The guard frowned and lowered his hand to his radio. "One more word, and I'll call for backup. Leave now, or it'll be worse for you." Katie felt the panic rising in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Turning around, she pretended to leave. But her mind kept repeating the thought: if I don't do something, this person will die. She paused around the corner, watching the entrance. The security guard had returned to his usual stance, hands in his pockets, his attention drifting. This was her chance. Katie cautiously moved back, keeping a close eye on his movements. She noticed a black car pull up to the restaurant, and the guard stepped forward to open the passenger door. While he was distracted, Katie dashed toward the entrance. Her footsteps were silent, and her slender frame blended with the shadows. She slipped inside, barely avoiding the doorframe. The interior of the restaurant was even more opulent than she had imagined. The marble floors gleamed, massive golden-framed paintings adorned the walls, and the soft glow from large chandeliers filled the room. But there was no time to admire it. Katie knew that every second brought the poisoned dish closer to its intended recipient. She crouched behind a large decorative vase with flowers, trying to catch her breath and gather her thoughts. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the person who was meant to receive the tainted food. I have to find him, she thought. I have to warn him, even if no one believes me. Katie stood up, careful not to draw attention, and took a few steps deeper into the hall. Her heart pounded in her chest, but fear couldn't hold her back anymore. She knew she was doing everything she could to save a life. Katie felt like a complete outsider, like a shadow that had no right to be there. But she couldn't stop. Time was running out, and she knew she was on the right path. Katie moved cautiously, hiding behind decorative columns and features, her footsteps barely making a sound against the cool marble. Where is he? She wondered, frantically scanning the guests. Her gaze landed on a central table, surrounded by several people. In the center sat a man, his posture and expensive suit indicating his high status. It had to be Andrew Warren. His face seemed familiar. She had seen him in newspapers she found in trash bins. She watched as a waiter approached the table, carrying a tray with a plate on it. The food was served with the elegance expected from a high-end restaurant. Katie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew this was the dish. Her breath quickened, and her hands instinctively clenched into fists. I need to act, she thought. In her head, a voice shouted, if you don't do something now, he will die. But another voice whispered fearfully, they'll throw you out. No one will listen to you. Katie took a deep breath and moved forward. She knew she had no choice. Katie ran to the table where Andrew was sitting and shouted loudly, don't eat that. Don't touch the food. Her voice sliced through the gentle hum of the restaurant, making everyone stop and turn to look. Katie saw Andrew lift his fork, staring at her in confusion. His eyebrows raised slightly, and his eyes questioned, who is this girl, and what is she doing here? There's poison in it. Your wife put poison in it. Katie had seen it. She shouted, trying to drown out the rising noise in the room. But everything happened too quickly. Andrew had already raised his fork, taking a bite of the dish. Within seconds, his face changed. It turned pale, beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, and his hand trembled as he lowered the fork back onto the plate. He took a sip of wine, but immediately started coughing. His breathing became labored, and his eyes clouded over. What's happening? A voice asked from a nearby table. Katie rushed closer, her heart racing with fear. It's poison. I saw everything. We need to call an ambulance, she yelled, turning to the people around her. But instead of offering help, the other guests began whispering among themselves. Some stood up, pushing their chairs back to distance themselves. Others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Katie saw the waiters freeze in place. I don't know what to do. Who is she? What is she doing here? A woman in an expensive dress shouted, pointing at Katie. One of the waiters finally approached Andrew, who was gasping for air and clutching his throat. He tried to help him up, but the man was too weak. Katie, ignoring the stares, grabbed Andrew's hand. Can you hear me? Hold on. We'll save you, she pleaded, but the looks from the crowd grew more suspicious. One of the guests loudly said, that girl poisoned him. She shouldn't even be here. Katie turned to face the man, her eyes filled with desperation. It wasn't me. It was his wife. She poisoned him. I saw it with my own eyes. Her voice quivered, but she pushed on. The security guard, who had finally noticed the chaos, rushed over to the table. He grabbed Katie's arm roughly. What have you done? He barked, pulling her away. Katie resisted, trying to break free. I didn't do anything. You have to believe me. He'll die if you don't call an ambulance, she shouted, trying to explain. Meanwhile, Andrew had collapsed onto the floor. His body began convulsing in spasms. Katie broke free from the guard's grip and rushed to his side, trying to support his head to prevent it from hitting the ground. She screamed, begging anyone to help. But people around her continued filming or talking about what had happened. Finally, someone from the staff yelled, call an ambulance. He's in danger. Katie knelt beside Andrew. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to do everything she could. Please, hold on. You're not going to die. She whispered, feeling tears streaming down her face. Andrew lay on the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably, his face growing paler by the second. Katie, with trembling hands, tried to keep his head steady, making sure it wouldn't hit the floor. His eyes rolled back, and his breathing grew shallow and ragged. The room filled with screams, but no one moved to help. "Someone, call an ambulance!" Katie yelled, scanning the crowd of guests. The waiters stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Katie glanced at the woman holding her phone. You're filming, and he's dying. Call the ambulance," she shouted desperately. The woman flinched but finally started dialing the number. Katie focused on Andrew. She knew he couldn't be left to suffocate. "We need to turn him on his side so he can breathe," she said loudly, but no one moved. "Help me, please." Finally, one of the waiters, a young guy, stepped forward, looking at her with wide eyes. "What can I do?" he asked. "Hold his legs, we need to turn him," Katie instructed firmly. Together, they carefully rolled Andrew onto his side. Katie supported his head, making sure he could breathe. "Breathe, please, hold on," she whispered, feeling tears streaming down her face. The crowd continued murmuring around them. Some suggested bringing water, others called for the manager, but there was little real action. Katie kept her focus on Andrew. After a few minutes, the distant sound of sirens reached her ears. Katie felt a small relief. The ambulance was coming, but Andrew was still shaking, and his skin had turned an ominous shade of blue. Katie turned to the waiter. "Tell the paramedics he's been poisoned, and ask them to bring an antidote." "This is important, it's poison," she urged, as if afraid she wouldn't be hurt again. When the restaurant doors opened, paramedics rushed in. They quickly surrounded Andrew, parting the crowd, and began administering aid. Katie stayed by his side, trying to explain everything she knew. "It's poison," she repeated, looking at the doctor. "I saw his wife slip it into his food. You have to save him." The doctor nodded, not asking questions, and continued working. Katie stepped aside, her hands trembling. Her breathing was shallow, but she knew the most important thing was that Andrew was now in the hands of professionals. But the relief was short-lived. 2 police officers in uniform entered the restaurant. Their stern faces signaled trouble. One of them approached the security guard at the entrance. "Where's the girl?" "The one who was shouting?" he asked. The guard pointed to Katie, and the officers walked toward her. Katie felt her heart stop. One of them roughly grabbed her by the shoulder. "So you're the one who caused all this?" the officer snapped. "You put something in his food." "No, I didn't do anything," Katie panicked, trying to break free. "I was trying to save him. I saw his wife poison him." "Stop lying," the second officer said. "We saw how you rushed over here. We have witnesses who claim you could have done something." Katie felt the cold metal of the handcuffs tighten around her wrists. Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept trying to explain herself. "Please, you have to believe me. It wasn't me. It was his wife. She poisoned him. I saw it all." Her voice trembled with desperation. One of the guests shouted from the crowd. "I saw her rush to the table. She must have put something in his food." "That's a lie." Katie screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the noise of accusations. The officers roughly pulled her toward the exit. Her legs barely supported her, but she kept shouting. "He'll say it wasn't me. I was trying to save him. You'll understand when he wakes up." The officers dragged her out of the restaurant, leaving the guests murmuring. Despite her fear and pain, Katie swore to herself that she wouldn't give up, even if no one believed her. She had done everything she could to save Andrew. Now, all she could do was hope that the truth would eventually come to light. The medical team had barely gotten Andrew to the hospital before they sprang into action. His body was still shaking with violent spasms. His breathing was labored and erratic, and his skin had turned a frightening pale blue hue. The doctors moved him to a stretcher, surrounded by machines, tubes, and syringes. "His oxygen levels are critically low," one of the doctors said, quickly attaching sensors to his chest. "Prepare the antidote immediately. We can't waste any time." Andrew was rushed to the intensive care unit, where everything was set up to fight for his life. The lead doctor, a man with a calm yet focused demeanor, took charge. His voice remained steady but firm, despite the gravity of the situation. "We suspect poisoning. Administer broad-spectrum antidote. Monitor the pulse and blood pressure. Report any changes immediately." The nurses and junior staff rushed around, connecting Andrew to IVs, monitors, and a breathing mask. The room was filled with the urgent beeping of medical equipment. The monitors emitted intermittent alarms, showing an unstable heart rhythm. "Blood pressure's dropping," one of the nurses exclaimed, looking at the screen. The doctor stayed focused. He took a syringe filled with the antidote and injected it into the IV. We wait for a reaction, he said. Monitor oxygen levels. If there's no improvement in 5 minutes, we'll repeat the dose. Seconds stretched on like hours. Everyone in the room stared at the monitors, hoping for even the slightest sign of improvement. Andrew remained unconscious, his body still on the white sheets, with only the rhythmic beeps of the machines confirming he was still alive. Look, the saturation is rising, one of the nurses said, glancing at the screen. 82, 85, 90. The doctor nodded, but there was no room for relief yet. All right, blood pressure stabilizing. Keep monitoring, we'll check his body's reaction to the antidote in an hour. After a few more minutes, signs of improvement became clearer. Andrew's skin lost its bluish tint, and his breathing evened out. His pulse, still weak, regained a more stable rhythm. We've stabilized him, but he's still in critical condition, the lead doctor said, stepping back from the bed. Let's prepare him for intensive care. As Andrew's condition stabilized, the doctors began running tests to determine what kind of poison had been used. This case was unusual, and they were concerned by how cleverly the poison had been administered. His reaction to the antidote has been positive, the doctor said, setting aside the file. If we'd been even 10 minutes late, the outcome would have been different. In the next room, a nurse whispered, "Such a rich man, and now he's in this mess. Who could want him dead?" The medical team continued working, closely monitoring Andrew's condition. Despite the improvements, the doctors knew it would take time for him to fully recover. But the key thing was, he was alive. Meanwhile, Katie sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, perched on a cold metal chair, her wrists bound tightly by handcuffs. Her small frame seemed even smaller in the sterile setting. Across from her, 2 officers sat at a table. One was tall, with thick eyebrows and a sharp voice. The other was shorter, with gray eyes that stared at Katie suspiciously. "Now, tell us again," the tall officer said coldly. "How did a girl from the streets end up in a fancy restaurant and almost poison one of the most powerful people in the city?" Katie lifted her head. Her eyes glistened with exhaustion and tension, but she was determined. "I didn't poison anyone," she said firmly. "I saw his wife slip something into his food. I tried to warn them, but no one believed me." The officer with the gray eyes scoffed. "Saw? Girl, do you understand how that sounds? You're a street kid? Who would believe your word against someone like Veronica Warren?" Katie felt a pang of fear inside, but she refused to back down. "It's the truth. I saw everything through the kitchen window." She pulled out a small vial and dropped something into his plate while his attention was distracted. "If I hadn't done something, he would have died." There was desperation in her voice. The tall officer shook his head, scribbling something in his notebook. "Your words mean nothing without evidence. Do you have proof? Maybe there's a recording? Witnesses?" Katie stared silently at the table. She knew she had none of that. Only her own eyes and heart, which couldn't stand by and watch Andrew die. Her silence was taken as an admission of guilt. "Just as I thought," said the tall officer, putting down his pen. "You're just making up a story to distract us from your own guilt. You knew who Warren was, and you tried to steal something, or maybe someone sent you." Katie gritted her teeth, her voice rising. "That's not true. I wanted to help. If I wanted to steal anything, why would I scream in front of everyone?" "Maybe you wanted to distract everyone," the officer with the gray eyes interrupted. "Or maybe you just wanted to make a scene so people would notice you." Katie felt tears welling up, but she quickly wiped them away. She couldn't show weakness. "I did what I had to do. I saw him get poisoned, and I tried to save him. If I hadn't said anything, he would have died." The sincerity in Katie's voice made the gray-eyed officer hesitate for a moment. He glanced at his partner, but the tall officer remained unmoved. "Listen, kid, this isn't a movie. Facts rule here, not words. And the facts are against you. People at the restaurant saw you rush to his table. No one saw this supposed poison scene. Only you." Katie desperately tried to argue. "You need to check the kitchen camera. There might be a recording. Talk to the chef, he was there." "Cameras?" The tall officer laughed. "At a place like that, the only cameras are by the cash register. There are none in the kitchen. And even if there were, do you really think they're working for a homeless girl?" The gray-eyed officer sighed quietly but didn't say anything. His partner continued. "You better admit it. Who helped you? Did you act alone, or was there someone else? Who gave you the poison?" "No one gave me anything," Katie cried out, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "I didn't poison anyone. It was her, Veronica. Why aren't you asking her? The tall officer leaned in closer, his face growing harder. Veronica Warren is a respected woman. She's known for her charity work and her connections. We have no reason not to trust her. As for you? He looked Katie over. You can't even prove you have a place to live, let alone your words. Katie clenched her fists. Inside, she was boiling with frustration, but she stayed firm. Andrew will wake up. He'll tell you that I tried to save him. He'll say it was her, not me. The officers exchanged glances. The tall officer shrugged. Fine, let him tell his story. But for now, you stay here. One more word, and I'll personally throw you in a cell. Katie silently stared at her accusers. Her eyes were full of determination. She knew the truth would come out eventually. The quiet in the ICU room was only broken by the steady beep of medical equipment. Slowly, Andrew opened his eyes, as if pulling himself from a deep, dark void. The first thing he felt was the heaviness in his body and the dryness in his mouth. His head spun, and his vision blurred. Where was he? What happened? He tried to raise his hand, but immediately, he felt something holding him down. It was the fourth drip. Turning his head just slightly, he saw the doctor bent over some records. Where am I? Andrew croaked, his voice weak and hoarse. The doctor looked up and quickly moved to his side. Welcome back, Mr. Warren, he said with a slight smile. You're in the hospital. You had a severe poisoning, but fortunately, we were able to stabilize your condition. Andrew furrowed his brow, trying to recall. Poisoning, he murmured, closing his eyes as fragments of memory began to return. The restaurant. The dish. The girl. Yes, the girl, the one who was shouting. She had been scared, begging him not to eat. The girl, he said, opening his eyes. There was a girl. She tried to save me. The doctor raised an eyebrow. What girl? None of your guests mentioned anything like that. No, Andrew tried to sit up but his body still wouldn't obey. She was shouting. She warned me. Told me there was poison, I remember. The doctor gently placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back to a lying position. Calm down, you need to rest. We'll talk about everything later. But Andrew couldn't just lie there. His mind was clearing, and one memory was becoming clearer with each passing second. The girl. She had rushed to him, risking everything to save him. You need to find her, he insisted. She was telling the truth, I saw her face. She was scared, but she tried to help. The doctor glanced at the nurse, who had stepped closer. We'll relay your request. But right now, you need to rest. Andrew didn't give up. His voice, though weak, was determined. I need to know what happened to her. If she's here, or if she's been arrested, find her. I'm sure she's not guilty. The doctor exchanged a look with the nurse and nodded. They both understood that their patient wouldn't calm down until he knew what had happened. Left alone, Andrew closed his eyes and replayed the events in his mind. The dish. The strange taste. The pain. But more than anything, he remembered the desperate voice of the girl, shouting for him not to eat. Her face, terrified yet determined, stayed with him, refusing to fade from his memory. He owed her his life, Andrew thought. And he would do whatever it took to prove it. The next day, feeling a bit better, he insisted on meeting with the doctors and police officers. His condition still didn't allow for long conversations, but he knew that any delay could cost the girl her freedom. When the investigator entered the room, Andrew went straight to the point. Where is the girl? He asked sharply, despite the weakness in his voice. The investigator looked at him in surprise. You mean the girl who was arrested at the restaurant? She's under suspicion for attempting to poison you. It's not looking good. That's not true, Andrew said firmly, trying to sit up. She's innocent. She tried to save me. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. The investigator frowned. But we have witnesses who say she rushed to your table. Many claim she could have poisoned your food, the investigator added. Andrew clenched his teeth. He was frustrated that no one wanted to see the obvious. Listen to me carefully, he said, looking the investigator straight in the eye. She warned me. She shouted that there was poison. Why would she do that if she were guilty? The investigator remained silent, as if considering the words. Check the security footage, Andrew continued. And ask the chefs. This girl told the truth. She couldn't have done it. But my wife. His voice trailed off. She was at the restaurant. Check her out. The investigator nodded, still looking uncertain. All right, Mr. Warren, we'll take that into account. But you understand that investigations take time. Andrew's face became serious. You've got time, but she doesn't. Every hour you keep her locked up makes you part of an injustice. I want her released immediately. The investigator sighed, noticing the firmness in Andrew's voice. We'll look into it. When the investigator left, Andrew felt exhausted, but he knew he had taken the first step. Now, all he could do was hope that his words would start changing the course of things. Katie had saved him, and he was ready to do anything to save her. Katie sat in her cold cell, hugging her knees to her chest. Her head rested against the wall, her eyes fixed on a single point. She had lost track of time. Thoughts of injustice and fear tormented her. Her wrists still ached from the handcuffs, her soul from the humiliation. She clung to one hope, that Andrew would wake up and tell the truth. The sound of footsteps outside her cell door made her jump. Moments later, the door opened, and a police officer stepped inside. Get up, he said shortly. You've been released. Katie stared at him, unable to believe her ears. Is this a joke? She asked, clutching the edges of her worn jacket. No, the officer replied flatly. You've got someone vouching for you. Hurry up, don't make us wait. When she stepped out of the cell, Andrew was there. He stood, slightly leaning on crutches. His face was still pale, but his eyes shone with determination. It's you. Katie looked at him with confusion and fear. Are you alive? She asked. Andrew smiled, despite his exhaustion. I'm alive because of you. I should have come sooner. Sorry for making you wait. Katie, not knowing what to say, lowered her head. Her heart was overwhelmed with emotions, relief, joy, and doubt. I tried, she began, but her voice cracked. I tried to explain, but no one believed me. Andrew gently touched her shoulder. I know. You did more than anyone could have expected. You saved my life, Katie. Now it's my turn to help you. Katie lifted her eyes, but there was skepticism in her gaze. Why? Why are you helping me? I'm nobody. Because you did what no one else could. You're stronger than you think, Andrew replied firmly. I want you to know something. You're not alone. Katie still couldn't believe it. She was used to being on her own, to no one offering help. But in Andrew's eyes, she saw sincerity. After a long silence, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. But I don't know what comes next. We'll figure it out together, Andrew said softly, guiding her toward the exit. Outside, Katie stopped, gazing at the bright morning city. She felt the cool air on her face, but for the first time in a long while, she felt warmth. Not from the sun, but from the fact that someone was there, ready to support her. Andrew, with his calm demeanor, seemed like he belonged to another world. Katie stopped at the gate, looking at him in confusion. You live here? She asked, nervously shifting from one foot to the other. Now you do, Andrew said with a smile. It will be safe here? Come on, I'll show you the house. Katie cautiously stepped inside. The high ceilings, soft carpets, and warm glow from the chandeliers seemed unreal to her. Her feet hesitated on the polished floor. She was afraid of breaking or dirtying something. Andrew led her to the guest room. This is yours, he said. Katie slowly stepped in. The white bedspread, neat desk, and wardrobe looked almost too perfect. She ran her hand over the fabric, feeling its softness. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly, not lifting her gaze. I'll help you start a new life, Andrew promised. And he kept his word. Soon, Katie started lessons with a private tutor that Andrew hired just for her. The first few days were hard for her. Her hands trembled as she held the pen, but she was making progress. The key is not to give up, Andrew encouraged. Katie learned not just to read and write, but also what it meant to trust people. Andrew became her mentor, someone who showed her that life could be different. Over time, Katie began to open up. She smiled more, became interested in books, and even helped around the house. Her eyes no longer held fear. Now, they sparkled with hope. One evening, sitting at the table, she shyly asked Andrew, have you always been this kind? Why don't you get angry at those who've hurt you? Andrew paused before answering. Anger doesn't change anything, Katie. I realized this because of you. You showed that even in the toughest situations, it's possible to do the right thing. Katie lowered her gaze, but a faint smile appeared on her face. She started to believe that her life could actually change. Months passed. Katie became more confident. She found the strength to move forward. Now, she saw the world not as a place to survive, but as an opportunity for growth. And all of this was because of the person who believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. The trial involving Veronica had gained a lot of attention. The Warren name was well known to many, and rumors of her attempted murder of her husband made the case even more scandalous. Journalists and lawyers crowded outside the courthouse, eagerly waiting to see how this scandal would unfold. Katie sat next to Andrew in the courtroom. She nervously fiddled with the hem of her dress, her heart pounding with anxiety. This was the first place where she felt like she was part of something important, but the thought that her testimony would matter terrified her. On the defendant's bench, Veronica still looked as elegant as ever. She kept a composed demeanor, throwing cold glares at everyone in the room. Her lawyers tried to argue that the accusations against her were nothing but rumors fueled by envy. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. The police had conducted a thorough investigation. Witnesses came forward who confirmed that Veronica had repeatedly threatened Andrew in their private conversations. Financial records revealed that she had planned to transfer a large sum of money to her secret account using her husband's power of attorney. Most importantly, one of the restaurant staff members admitted to seeing Veronica enter the kitchen that evening, even though it was strictly prohibited. When Katie was called to testify, she stood up, feeling her legs shake slightly. Andrew gave her a reassuring look, and it gave her the strength she needed. "Tell the court what you saw that night," the prosecutor asked. Katie took a deep breath and began speaking. She described how she had been going through the trash, how she saw Veronica through the kitchen window, and how she then noticed a small bottle and saw Veronica add something to a dish. "Why did you decide to act?" the prosecutor asked. "I knew someone could get hurt," Katie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't just watch and do nothing." When she finished, the room fell silent. Even Veronica's defense had no response to her words. It was irrefutable, this street-smart girl, with nothing to lose, simply couldn't be lying. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict. Veronica was found guilty of attempted murder and fraud. She was sentenced to a long prison term, and part of her assets were confiscated in favor of Andrew. Katie watched as Veronica was led out of the courtroom. For the first time, she felt that truth could really win. Andrew squeezed her hand and smiled. "It's because of you." Katie smiled back for the first time. She no longer felt vulnerable. Her story had become part of something much bigger. After the trial, Andrew and Katie began a new chapter in their lives. For Andrew, it was a release from a painful past, while for Katie, it was a fresh start she had never imagined. Andrew suggested they create a foundation to help children in difficult circumstances. Katie immediately agreed. She understood what it felt like to be invisible, to fight alone just to survive. The foundation became their shared mission. Together, they visited orphanages and organized events to support homeless children. Katie, who had once lived on the streets, was now helping others. Her past no longer felt like a burden, but a source of strength she was proud of. "You've become an example, Katie," Andrew said one day, after they returned from another event. "You show that even the darkest places can be escaped from." Katie smiled, her eyes glowing with warmth. "I'm just doing what's right," she replied. "Like you taught me." They both knew their journey had only just begun. But now, they walked it together, helping others find light in the darkness. Thank you for listening to this story. Apologies for any mistakes, please share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.